Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture of the Civitas Institute here at UT Austin. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Executive Director for Research at the Civitas Institute, and really delighted to be able to welcome you here today and to introduce our guest, Dr. Melissa Kearney. Dr. Kearney is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. She wears other hats as well, including being the director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. She's a research associate at NBER, a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she was also a past director of the Hamilton Project. I used to work at the building next to Brookings, and we were just talking beforehand about how it's amazing we actually never ran into each other there on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington. Dr. Kearney focuses on a wide range of domestic policy issues, focusing primarily on social policy, poverty, and inequality, and is published in the top journals on these issues and regularly cited in the popular press. You've probably seen her quoted if you read articles about these issues. And her latest book, Two-Parent Privilege, dives right into some controversial topics. It's ignited quite a bit of debate and prompted a lot of response, and that's exactly the kind of conversation that we like to host here at the Civitas Institute. So I'm really delighted that Dr. Kearney's given some of her time to us today. So please join me in welcoming Melissa Kearney to UT Austin.
Thanks very much. Okay, thanks, Ryan, and thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. So I am going to be talking about my book, The Two-Parent Privilege. It came out in September, and the conversations it's sort of brought about have really been the best part of the whole process for me. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I plan to give an overview of the main themes and sort of data that I'm highlighting in the book, but I'm happy to be interrupted as we go along, and I look forward to the conversation we'll have when I'm done with what I've prepared. Okay, so first I want to situate the topic and the book in really sort of the area that brings me to this issue of what I call the two-parent privilege, and that's really an interest in inequality and social mobility in America. These are the sort of overriding topics that have been motivating me for the past 2 decades to write about what I write and study what I study. And I've been in a lot of policy-focused conversations about these topics over the past 2 decades. As Brian mentioned, in addition to my university appointment, I do a lot of work with the think tanks in DC, and in those roles, I've been part of a lot of these conversations. And it just sort of struck me a few years ago that we were having the same conversation over and over, and I felt like we weren't talking about what I think is probably the most important issue driving class gaps and affecting kids' well-being in this country, and that's the issue of families. And so in my experience in these types of conversations, what they wound up focusing on over and over was the need for a stronger government safety net for families, the need for improved schools. These are things I'm all for, I've written about. These conversations will focus on the need for affordable housing, expanded college access, criminal justice reform, stronger labor market institutions, progressive tax reform, all things that as economists and policy observers, we sort of know how to deal with. We can actually, pretty easily come up with a proposal for progressive tax reform that would give us more money to redistribute to lower income families. The politics sometimes get in the way, but the policies and the economics are not that hard. But then I would often mention, well, what do we do about the divide in families that's happening in the US? And as I tell the story in the book, it would be very often, and this happened time after time, it would be met with like sort of uncomfortable shifting in seats. And I think a lot of that was well-meaning. It feels like discussing the family is really personal. Everybody has sort of a visceral reaction to the topic. And it's also really hard for us as economists or policy advocates to really know what to do about it. So my goal in this book was to say we can't keep ignoring it because it's uncomfortable to talk about or we don't have an obvious policy lever to pull. I do think, and what I'm going to try and convince you of, this is a really important issue that needs to be at the top of our policy agenda, addressing inequality and social mobility in America. So that's what this is about. Let me just start with some basic motivating facts. The first is that there's been a really seismic shift in the way kids in the US are being raised over the past 40 years. In particular, what I want to call attention to is what's pretty stunning drop in the share of US kids growing up with married parents. It's now at a point of time, 63%. And so all of this is coming from US Census data on households. If we looked at longitudinal data and looked at the share of kids who would spend any of their time in their childhood outside of two-parent home, it would be even greater. So everything I'm doing is a snapshot in time. Only 63% are now in married parent homes. Importantly, it's not the case that what's happened in the US is just that, oh, now parents are largely living together as if they're married but not getting the legal title. Only 8% of kids in the US Census live in what we categorize as cohabiting parents. And what that means is kids live with one of their biological parents and their parent's partner, their unmarried partner. If we look in other data sets, we can see that in about a quarter to 40% of those cases, that second parent figure is actually not the child's biological parent. And so some of those situations actually get quite complicated. So even if you add the 8% to the 63% to say what share of kids are living in two-parent homes, I just want to be clear that that overstates the share of kids living with their two parents. Beyond marriage, the next most common living situation for kids in this country is living with an unpartnered mother. So a mom who has neither a spouse nor an unmarried partner in their home. And then we've got about 4.5% of kids living with unpartnered fathers and about 4.5% of kids living with neither parent. So about 30% of the kids in the US live outside a married parent or two-parent home. US children have the unfortunate, and I will say unfortunate, recognizing that's a normative term here, the unfortunate distinction of being more likely than kids in any other country in the world for whom we have this data to live in a single-parent home. So this map comes from the Pew Research Center. By their methodology, about 23% of US kids lives in a one-parent home. That is much more than the average across these 130 countries of 7%. It's more than the European Union, where the average is 13%. You can see the rates of single-parent homes are exceptionally low in Asia, which we'll come back to because we'll see that they're also low among Asian Americans in this country. The only country that's really starting to catch up with us is the UK. And actually, single parenthood is sort of sneaking up on a lot of, I think, high-income European countries in a way that they're not quite recognizing. I keep talking to demographers and scholars and journalists over in Europe, and I'm like, look at the lessons from the US, because this actually is going to be a troublesome trend for the UK and other high-income countries. All right. It is not the case that the reason that US women are most likely to find themselves in the position of raising their kids by themselves is because they're so much more economically secure and successful. In fact, the most economically successful women in the US are the least likely to be raising their kids outside a married parent setting. And this is critically important and is a major theme of my book, which is the college gap in family structure. And so what I'm showing you here is what's happened over the past 40 years to children's living arrangements by maternal education. And so you can see that in the top line, these are children who live with their moms, who in the census identify as having a four-year college degree or more. The share of moms with a four-year college degree has grown dramatically over the past 40 years. It went from 11% to 30%, and yet marriage is still holding very strong among that group, even though it's less selective, more varied now. So there's only been a 6 percentage point decline in the share of those children living with married parent homes. In stark contrast, what we see is outside that class, there's been a really stunning decline. In particular, I think what surprises a lot of people is how precipitous the decline in marriage has been among moms with a high school degree or some college. So in the 80s, there was a large rise in single motherhood among the most disadvantaged moms without a high school degree. A lot of these moms were teen moms. People were worried about this. Some scholars, I'm thinking in particular of Sarah McClanahan, started writing about this in by the late 1980s, early 1990s. I don't think anybody really would have predicted in 1990 that what would happen over the next 30 years is that the middle educated group of women would converge down. Such that now it's not just that the most disadvantaged women, those who are teen moms, less than a high school degree, are unmarried. It's the college educated moms who are standing apart. They're the ones with a really high rate of raising their kids in married parent homes, and everyone else stands apart. And so this is why I'm really emphasizing the idea of marriage among parents as now a privilege of an already privileged group. And so that's why anyone who cares about equity and inequality should be really bothered and worried about this, that it's the most successful group in society, the group that's been doing really well over the past 40 years, for whom the institution of marriage and raising their kids in a married parent home is holding strong. If we look at the numbers by cohabitation instead, it doesn't change the story. Children whose moms identify as having a four-year college degree in the census, only 12% of them live with an unpartnered mother as compared to 29 or 30% of everybody else. So again, we see the convergence of the middle group to the least educated moms. There's also a major racial ethnic element to this issue in the US, such that really the way you want to think about these differences is sort of by race and ethnicity cross education. So what I'm showing in this figure is the share of kids living in different family arrangements by the mom's racial identity and her level of education. And there's two things that are really notable here. First, let me just point out the differences across the racial and ethnic groups. So in the US, 88% of children whose moms identify as Asian American live in a married parent home. 88%, okay? And the second thing to point out is for that group, we don't really see a college divide or much of an education gradient. I didn't know this before I did the data work for this book. I thought this was really interesting, and I think it warrants further study. But you see that even less educated Asian parents are raising their kids in very high numbers in married parent homes. White children are the next most likely to be living in a married parent home, 77% of them, as compared to 62% of children whose moms identify in Hispanic and only 38% of children whose mom identify in Black. And my contention in this book, as uncomfortable as it might be, we will not close racial gaps in kids' outcomes if we don't address this parental divide, given how much family structure and home environment dictates kids' opportunities and outcomes in life. And so we can keep talking about all the things we need schools to do. We can keep hiring more counselors in schools until we strengthen families. I don't see any reason to think that class gaps are going to dramatically close in terms of kids' outcomes and experiences. Okay, moving beyond this, the other interesting thing to note is that over the past 40 years, this college gap has emerged within race and ethnic groups outside of Asian Americans. So among the children, for example, whose moms identify as Black, those whose moms have a college degree are twice as likely to be living in a married parent home as others, 60% versus 31 or 30. And this education gradient really emerged over the past 40 years. This is what's sort of new here. This is data, the same data from 1980. And here you see that over the 60s and 70s, a Black-white gap emerged in family structure. Scholars were starting to write about that. Daniel Patrick Moynihan called attention to it in his very famous and controversial 1965 Department of Labor memo. So the Black-white gap emerged, was visible by the 80s, and it's really the next 40 years. What we saw is basically the decline in married parents outside the college-educated class for the three major race and ethnic groups in the US. Okay, one of the points I make in the book that I think is underappreciated in our popular discussions about inequality in the US is the fact that this divergence in family structure has, in a very mechanical sense, amplified the economic insecurity of the middle class and widened household income inequality. So what I'm showing you here is data tabulated by family structure and mom's level of education and the earnings growth between 1979 and 2018. So let me walk you through this a bit. So in the top panel, I'm looking at households headed by two parents by mom's level of education. Okay, so this will be familiar to labor economists, is the kind of thing we do. We're like, let's hold fixed family structure. Actually, what labor economists tend to do is say, let me look at two parents both working full-time, full year, really just to look at labor market effects. I'm going to do one step removed from that. These are two parents, and I'm going to let them, regardless of how they've allocated their work effort between them. What you see is over the past 40 years, household earnings for the college-educated group increased by 59%, for the middle group increased by 8%, for the bottom group fell by 14%. This is the very well-known story of rising income inequality, okay? The college-educated did really well, the middle sort of stagnant, the bottom lost some earnings, okay? That's household earnings inequality. In the second panel, I'm showing you the change in earnings for households headed by an unpartnered mom. First thing, let's just notice how far left I am. So on average, Two-parent households bring in about twice as much income as single-parent households. That's not surprising. Most moms work, and so married parent households tend to have two workers in the household as compared to one. Okay, so the 2-to-1 is something that's a major theme in my book. But you see here that all households headed by unpartnered mothers have experienced substantial earnings growth over this time period, though still the levels are low. 60%, 19%, and 24% earnings. Unpartnered mothers are doing better than they have in the past. There's lots of explanations for that, lots of stories about welfare reform, earned income tax credit. We know single moms are going to work much more than they used to. In the bottom panel, what I do is just let family structure move the way it did. So now I'm looking at all families with children, what happened to their earnings, their household earnings. The top group, their household earnings went up by 55%. Not much less than the other two. Why? Because there was barely a drop off in the share of those households that had 2 adults in the household. But now the middle educated group, instead of an 8% increase in household earnings or a 19% increase in household earnings, there's a 4% decrease in household earnings. Why? Because those households now are 23 percentage points less likely to have 2 adults in the household, right? So you combine stagnant earnings with a very sizable increase in the likelihood of only having 1 adult in the household, and what you get is much more economic insecurity among, let's call this group the middle class, than we would have from labor market changes alone. Similarly for the bottom group. The large increase in the likelihood of only having 1 adult in this household means that the earnings changes are amplified in a negative way, adding to the economic insecurity in this group. So the main point here is that family divergence is contributing, again, just very mechanically, to income inequality, differences in economic security across different groups in society. Okay, we also know from the work that's being done by the lab that's now called the Opportunity Insights Lab out of Harvard. This is the group headed by Raj Chetty that has access to millions of IRS tax records. We know that at a neighborhood level, family structure is one of the most highly predictive factors of rates of upward mobility for kids. So in their first paper that came out of this tremendous data trove of tax data, published in an economics journal in 2014, they mapped social mobility across the country, and then they revealed which factors associated with a neighborhood had, sort of their level of correlation with rates of upward mobility for kids from those neighborhoods. This was figure 4 in their paper, and it quite literally took my breath away in a way that's really, really humbling to economists. Because what you see very clearly in their work is that all the things that we spend most of our time talking about, college tuition, colleges per capita, EITC exposure, all of these things had very low levels of correlation with social mobility rates. Instead, the most highly correlated factors were the fraction of households headed by married parents, the fraction of households headed by single moms in a negative way, the share of adults who are high school dropouts, and what they call social capital index. When I saw this was really the paper that was like, we've been just talking about the wrong things. And it sort of underscored my commitment to trying to bring these issues that, again, are harder for us to talk about as economists and we're less clear what to do about them, bring them into the policy conversation around income inequality and social mobility. So that's just sort of the lay of the land by way of background motivation. Now I'll, sort of in an equally brief or high-level way, just talk about the way I outline in the book why this matters for kids. And here, there's not rocket science here. It's pretty obvious. This feels intuitive to most people. This is one of those books where, some people are like, wow, this is so controversial. And other people are like, duh, I didn't need a professor to tell me this. But I'm going to tell you anyway. 2 parents tend to have more combined resources than 1 parent alone. And that is like the major theme, okay? And so it's actually really important to point out, though, I'm not thinking about marriage or parental marriage as any sort of moral or value-laden proposition. In my lens on marriage, and the way I talk about it in a book, is it's a long-term contract between 2 adults to pool their resources and jointly consume and produce household resources, and when there are children, engage in the raising of those kids. Because it's written for a popular audience, I say things about how I know people love each other and they respect each other and all that's really important too. But in my model, it's just about the pooling of resources. And so we should be able to acknowledge that two parents have more resources at their disposal to bring to the really hard task of raising kids than one parent alone. And to say that doesn't denigrate single moms or single dads or the heroic efforts they're going to raise their kids the best they can. It's just a reflection, a really, very, very clear in the data reflection of the reality that it takes a lot of resources to raise kids, and two people have more combined resources. So what are the resources I really emphasize and what I think we have a lot of good, solid evidence on? Resources broadly defined. It's income, it's time, and it's mental energy or mental load and bandwidth. And so, I'll unpack that a bit. And I also want to be very clear, of course, the specific context and situation matters. And none of this is to say that in every case, kids would be better if two parents were in the home, right? Nothing I'm saying or write in the book should be misconstrued as suggesting that anybody should stay in an abusive or violent situation, for instance. What I'm focusing on is on average in general, and then trying to figure out what are the mechanisms through which a two-parent or married parent home tends to be very beneficial for kids. So let me start with one slide summary of basically hundreds and hundreds of academic papers across various disciplines that have tried to look at this relationship between family structure and kids' outcomes. Now, the gold standard in social science when you want to make a causal statement is to have a randomized control trial and randomly assign some people to experience one kind of treatment or intervention and the others not to. We will never have an RCT that randomly assigns kids to live with married parents or not. That's a good thing. And so what social sciences have done instead is basically tried to replicate that idea. How can I compare the outcomes of kids, how it varies by family structure or mother's marital status, controlling for as many of the other things as possible. And what these studies show us, study after study after study, is that even when you're comparing moms who live in the same place, who have the same, started childbearing at the same age, who have the same level of education, even kids who grow up within the same household but experience different family formations because of changes in parental marriage, what we see over and over again in these studies is that children who grow up in a single mother home, and most of the research has focused on single mothers because they have always been the lion's share of single parent households. Now they're 80% of single parent households. Children who grow up in that setting, as compared to children who grow up with married parents, they are much more likely to live in poverty. They're more likely to have cognitive or behavioral struggles. They have worse health outcomes. And then in the longer term, we see that kids who grow up in single parent homes ultimately tend to, on average, achieve lower levels of education, lower levels of income. They're more likely to live in poverty as adults. They're more likely to be single moms or single parents themselves as adults. These differences are controlled for observable characteristics. So there is something about family structure. Now, the real skeptic who is just so committed to not admitting that family structure might have a causal effect will say, well, we just don't know. There might be something unobservably different about people who are married and not, such that even if those single moms were married, their kids would still be at a deficit. I see no reason to think that single parents are innately, widespread going to be worse parents than married parents. But what I see very clearly is having a second parent in the home brings in a ton of additional resources that we know benefit kids. And so that's why I push this resource-based framework, okay? So the differences are really clear. Nobody really can quibble with the fact that the research finds these differences. The interesting question is, what is it that's driving the differences? What are the mechanisms, okay? So what I want to put forward is that income is a key mechanism, and lots of studies have shown that, but it's not just income. And the reason why this really matters is because a lot of people, again, who don't want to focus on family structure and policy conversations, will say, it's not about family structure, it's about income. And once we control for income, a lot of the differences go away. Now, that's all very well in our regression analysis, but in the real world, we don't equalize income. We have no policy even being considered remotely that would say, oh, okay, let's just take all the families who have one parent and give them the median earnings of a second parent. There's no policy lever in the real world that equalizes those resources, that says, we're arguing right now in Congress about $2,000 extension to the child tax credit, which, by the way, I am all for. But the differences in median household income we're talking about are like $55,000. So even if we manage to pass an extended child tax credit, the resource differences are going to be huge. And by the way, on average, a second parent does more than just bring income into the household, let alone $2,000, okay? So what else do they do? Let's start by thinking about how parental inputs turn into kids' outcomes. And so here again, I take a very economic lens to the issue of raising kids and recognizing, of course, that those of us who have kids love our kids. We enjoy spending time with them. We want them just to be happy, okay? But let's strip that stuff out and just think about the economic lens on this. I liken it to an assembly line factory production. You put inputs into a process, and then there's a production function that turns those inputs into output, and the outputs I'm thinking about are measures of kids' educational attainment, their earnings, things we can readily see that are sort of recognized as markers of economic success. Again, none of this is to take away from everything else we're trying to do when we raise kids, raise kind, loving, happy human beings. But these are the kinds of things we can focus on when we're talking about income inequality and social mobility. So this is like a flowchart representation of a model that Phil Levine and I put forward in an annual review of economics paper to make the point that there are going to be heterogeneous or varied effects of parental marriage depending on the specific context and the outcome we're talking about. So different moms bring different level of resources to the home. If we're thinking about a teen mom who dropped out of high school, it might be very hard for her to keep her child out of poverty if she lives alone. If she were to marry her partner, let's say her child's father, who's also a teen dad who dropped out of high school, who's not bringing in income, even together, they might not be able to keep their child out of poverty, let alone get their child through college. Now let's think about, a 40-year-old mom with an MBA and a six-figure salary who's a single mom. She probably can keep her kid out of poverty. She probably can provide a resource-rich home to get her child through high school. She might even be able to get her kid through college, though achieving college, four-year college degree is still a really hard to achieve outcome for most kids. That's pretty concentrated among the most advantaged households in this country. But what about where the main changes in society has been? What about the mom with a high school education who's making $35,000, whose partner maybe has a couple college classes under his belt or a trade degree and he's making $50,000? Whether they combine their income might make the difference between what neighborhood they live in, whether their child gets through high school. So this is what I mean about thinking about what the mom brings herself, including all the resources she gets from family members and the government, what the partner would bring to the household, and what outcome we're talking about. Okay, so we write down this model and we take it to the longitudinal data set, the PSID, and basically the upshot is the data really supports the intuition here. And let me just show you a couple just unadjusted differences to make the point. So all I'm doing here is plotting the percent of children with a high school degree by age 20 by the mom's education level, those are the different bars, and then the different shading is whether the mom is single or married. That's what we see in the data, okay? Let me make a comment on that. The reason why we look at marital status is that's what we see, but also remember that marital status is very predictive of whether there's two adults in the household, okay? In the US, we really don't have a widespread, robust alternative where parents are living together, cohabiting in long-term non-marital arrangements. So if any single moms are living with a partner, those, the differences are net of the additional resources that's bringing. This is just by marital status. So what do we see? Okay, for kids whose moms have less than a high school degree, 68% of them will have a high school degree by 20, and there's a small increment of 6% among those who are married. At the higher end, 89% of kids whose moms have a college degree will have a high school degree by age 20. There's a small increment of 4% if the mom's married. The larger gaps occur in the middle, exactly where we would really expect, where the additional resources provided by a second parent are probably more impactful on this margin. And so there we see increments of 9% or 8% in the difference of whether the kid graduates high school by mother's marital status. When we control for income, okay, that lessens the gap, but it does not eliminate them. Okay, the gap and the pattern remains. Now I'm showing you the gap in kids' college completion by maternal education. So here, let's look at kids whose moms have less than a high school degree. Only 7% of them graduate with a 4-year college degree by age 25, even if the parents are married. Very little difference. But then, as we get higher levels of education, the share doubles. And it doubles in, the magnitude differences are large. So if you look at the moms who have some college or college degree, 14% and 29% of their children will get a college degree by age 25, as compared to 31% and 57% if they're married. This is I want to stress this because so much of the literature on single motherhood in particular has focused on poverty. And still, all of the policy papers about how to improve lives for single moms, the kids of single moms, is about reducing rates of poverty, because the children of single moms in the US Census, their poverty rates are about 5 times as high as kids whose parents are married, like 25 to 5%, okay? I am all for doing more to reduce rates of poverty among all children in this country, in particular the children of single moms who are disproportionately represented in the poverty population. But it's not just about poverty. We want to do more than just keep kids out of poverty. Getting through college is a really big marker of economic security and success in this country. And these gaps by family structure are enormous. And in fact, there's a recent paper in a macroeconomics journal that basically shows that these differences by family structure and family home environment have become even more important over time to kids' human capital development. And in their simulations, affecting these differences do more than any of the other policy simulations, ideas we usually talk about to get kids through college, like tuition assistance, okay? So this is really important, not just for differences in poverty. When I control for income, this gap of 28% only goes down to 20%. And that underscores the point that second parents do more than just bring income into the home. All right, so what else do they do? I focus on 3 big buckets in the book. We have data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey that higher income families, and again, those are dominated by married parent families, they are spending so much on their kids these days. I reproduced this from a paper by 2 sociologists, and what it's just showing is what some of you might intuitively have been experiencing, especially if you're parents and think about how things differ from when we grew up. The top percentile of households have just pulled away in how much they're spending on kids' enrichment activities, educational activities. This doesn't even account for housing, which is one of the biggest investments parents really make in their kids' childhood opportunities. So the gaps have really grown. So that's the first thing. The second thing I do is tabulate data from the American Time Use Survey, which shows very clearly that higher educated parents and married parents are spending more time with their kid. And in this data set, you can't combine at the household level. So what I'm showing you is married and unmarried mothers and married and unmarried fathers. And we see that married parents separately spend more time with their kids. So when you pool them, the amount of time investment that kids are getting from their parents is even larger as compared to kids from single mother homes. Again, this isn't rocket science. I felt so silly. I was talking to a group of single moms showing them this, as if they needed a professor to look at nationally representative data to tell them they don't have as much time to spend with their kids. But really, this validates the experience of many single moms. Yes, I'm the only one working, paying the bills, putting dinner on the table, mowing the lawn, trying to help my kid with homework. Of course, they don't have as much time to do all those things with their kids that higher income, higher resource parents do. And the final bucket of resources that I describe in the book is called various things by scholars across various disciplines. I refer to it really as emotional bandwidth, okay? Psychologists have documented that single mother homes have much higher rates of toxic stress. Behavioral economists have talked about cognitive bandwidth. Again, the idea, which I bring evidence to bear on, will feel very familiar to anyone who's raised a kid. If you're stressed, at the end of the day, it's really hard to speak patiently to your kid or to sit down and help them with their homework patiently. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? And so this is why, too, I'm all for more resources and income and tax credits being redistributed to low-income homes, but none of that helps the single parent who doesn't have someone else there to pick up the slack or to turn to when they just need a break. And all of that affects kids' outcomes and development. Okay, additional characteristics real quick. Does a couple need to be married? In theory, in my lens on all this, which is again a very economic-based, resource-based framework, no. In theory, two parents can live together in a committed, stable, cohabiting relationship and get the same outcomes for the kids. In practice, that is very, very rare. So I think this raises really interesting questions that I'm not an expert on. What is it about marriage that yields this long-term stability that other couples aren't achieving? And when you look at surveys of unmarried, mostly low-income couples at the time of their birth, they're very optimistic about staying together. Most of them, the overwhelming majority, say they want to, but then the majority of them are not together by their child's fifth birthday. Okay, so there is something about the institution of marriage, whether it's the legal arrangement, whether it's making the ex-ante commitment, that seems to yield this stable, pooling, resource-based household for kids. And I think that's something, just again, in practice, that's what we have. That's why it seems to matter in practice. Do the parents need to be biological? This moves us away from a resource perspective, which is my focus in the book, to a relationship perspective, though there are lots of sociologists and psychologists who have dug more into the differences in how kids do with the different relationships of their parent. In some sense, the reason why I'm abstracting from that largely is because I don't want us to lose sight of what's really happened over the past 40 years, which is the tremendous rise in the kids not living with married parents or two parents, as opposed to how the relationships have changed. So in my framework and in my data work, for example, I treat same-sex couples the same as married biological parents, because I'm really focused on the 2 versus 1. But those alternative arrangements are just not what's driving the overall trends or the family structure divide across classes. Finally, what about harmful parents? As I said earlier, there's nothing in anything I'm saying that should be misconstrued to suggest that anyone should stay in a harmful or an abusive situation. If you think of the resource-based framework that I put forward, when we think about the additional resources that the second parent would bring into the home, if the second parent would bring harm or chaos, then that clearly won't be good for the kid. And in fact, we have 2 recent papers in economics, one studying the context of the country of Colombia and one in Ohio, that looks at what happens when a parent who has been found guilty of a crime is randomly assigned to a judge who's more likely to put that parent in prison. And it turns out that both of those papers find that that seems to be beneficial for kids. Okay, and so that's a little bit of sad finding, but it also underscores the point that if the parent might bring, again, chaos or harmful elements to the home, it's like the data show that in some of those situations, it's actually better for the child if the parent's removed from the home. Okay, so another just point to make is that research shows that boys are particularly disadvantaged by growing up in a single mother household. So let's just, in terms of what's gone on with boys over the past 40 years, boys are struggling. Okay, this has been well documented. Boys are much more likely to get suspended in school. They are now, they tend to have lower GPAs. Among young adults, girls are more likely, or young women are more likely to enroll in college and complete a 4-year degree. Okay, boys are falling behind girls on a whole bunch of metrics. Scholars have noted a correspondence of trends such that as the share of kids in this country growing up in single-parent homes has risen, so too has the relative disadvantage of boys. And 2 more recent papers, one from 2013 and one from 2019, really do quite a compelling job looking at administrative data sources to show that the gender gap in schooling outcomes and behavioral issues in school, okay, we're focused on like kids in K through 12, these papers, that the gender gap in outcomes, which favors girls, is larger among children raised in single mother homes. And then the paper by Marianne Bertrand and Jessica Pond goes farther in documenting that finding, trying to unpack what's behind it. And what they see in their data set is that as compared to boys growing up with married parents, boys who grow up in a single mother homes do receive, in general, they're more likely to receive harsher punishments, harsher parenting, less parental nurturing, as reported by the mom herself. But those differences aren't large enough to explain the gap. What they say is really important to explaining the gap is the finding that boys are particularly responsive to parental inputs. Or conversely, the sort of deficit of parental inputs disproportionately affects boys as compared to girls. Now, I want to be careful because this doesn't suggest that girls aren't struggling, but we know from development psychology research, et cetera, that when boys are struggling, they tend to engage in externalizing behavior. That means like they're going to go to school and get in a fight in the playground. They're going to get involved in crime. They're going to do the kinds of things that get them in trouble in school, in trouble with the law, and maybe really derail their educational and economic path. Girls who are struggling are more likely to engage in internalizing behavior and self-harm. And so I don't want to minimize any of that, but it's not hard to imagine that that would just be less likely to knock them off, let's say, their educational path, okay? And so that's what these studies show this as about boys. Again, if we look at the work coming out of the Opportunity Insights Lab that looks at the factors at a neighborhood level that are correlated with more upward mobility in adulthood, really striking finding from a recent paper that looks at Black-white differences in adult earnings. So what this paper is about is documenting what neighborhood characteristics are predictive of a smaller gap in adult earnings between Black and white boys. And the single biggest predictor of a smaller gap, which means the single biggest predictor of better relative outcomes for Black boys in adulthood, is the share of households in their neighborhood where there's a Black father present. And so what this shows quite strikingly is that beyond the benefits of having a dad in one's own home, basically dads in the neighborhood are like a public good. And Black dads in the neighborhood are protective and helpful for Black boys growing up in that neighborhood. Okay? So this too is just like yet another finding at the neighborhood level that suggests that family structure is critically important to thinking about what's going on in terms of how those kids in a neighborhood do when they grow up. Okay, so what is driving these trends? Hopefully I've convinced you that the trends are really important. The trends matter for kids' outcomes. Now what's behind them? Let me just show you mechanically, this is not a story of more divorce. Divorce conditional on marriage is down. This is a story of more parents never getting married. So if you just look at unpartnered mothers' marital status in the census, in 1980, 64% of those unpartnered mothers got there through divorce. Only 22% were never married. That rose dramatically over the 40 years, such that now a small majority of unpartnered mothers have never been married, okay? If we do this by mother's education, you see that among moms with a four-year college degree, they are unpartnered mothers with a four-year college degree, they're still more likely to be divorced than never married. That's not true for the less educated mothers. If you think about this from a resource perspective, this too really matters because it means that even among kids whose moms have a four-year college degree and are unpartnered, those kids were more likely to have had two parents in their household at some time. And we know that kids whose parents are divorced, they are much more likely to be getting child support from the second parent. They're much more likely to have engagement with the second parent. So there's even this college gap in resources and second parent involvement among unpartnered mother situations. There are similar, very large differences across race and ethnic group in the marital status of unpartnered mothers. Okay. Second, what I just showed you, really reflects a larger decrease in marriage among adults without a four-year college degree. Okay, so that's why marriage winds up playing such a prominent role in my book. It's because it's really this decrease in marriage that's led to the change in kids' living arrangements. So what I'm showing you here, this is one of the rare places where I go back to the 1960s as opposed to just 1980. because what I want you to see is that in the 1960s and 70s, when there were big social cultural changes in the US, changes in social norms, gender norms, a reduction in the institution of shotgun marriage, there was a reduction in marriage across all three education groups of roughly equal proportion. And then we go into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and the decline in marriage stalls out among college-educated adults. It's like college-educated adults worked out the social cultural changes in the 60s and 70s and landed at a new equilibrium level of marriage. But things continue to decrease outside the college-educated class. The story I tell in the book is basically that in the 60s and 70s, there were changes in social norms. Then you went into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and we experienced economic changes that hit these education groups differently, and it was the combination of those two factors that led us to where we are. So I'll unpack that a little bit in a minute. This happened, again, across race and ethnic groups, across education groups, much larger outside the college-educated class, and much less pronounced among Asian Americans. There's various explanations. There's the marriageable male hypothesis. And so in rough strokes, what is that? So this idea of a marriageable man was this, I'm citing here the work of William Julius Wilson, very prominent scholar sociologist, who in the 1980s put forward the idea that there were fewer marriageable men in the Black community, and that was responsible for the widening of marriage and family structure between Blacks and whites at that time. Now I'm borrowing that concept and applying it to, instead of just Black-white groups, non-college and college-educated adults. This idea of a decline in the marriageable men fits with the general trends. Non-college educated men are less likely to be working now than in the past. Their absolute earnings might have stalled out. This is related but distinct, though it's very hard to separate out the two in data. It's related to the concept of women's relative economic position improving. So even if men didn't do worse over time, or non-college educated men, but they just stayed stagnant, as women gained more economic opportunities and earnings potential, the value proposition of marriage for them eroded to some extent, okay? And again, there's consistent, I'm gonna show you the patterns in the data are consistent with this idea. And on both of these, 1 and 2, we have causal evidence from very nice studies in economics showing causal channels. Charles Murray and others will more emphasize cultural shifts. I do find a role for culture in all of this, and ultimately I think it's both changes in cultural and social norm and changes in economics that have led us to where we are. I reject pretty resoundingly the idea that the reason we have such a high level of single mother or one-parent households in the US now is because of an overly generous welfare system. There's a debate that we could have about whether the creation of programs in the 60s and 70s sort of had a sizable effect. What I'm talking about here is we had welfare reform in the mid-1990s. It's made welfare less generous, harder to access. And so my read of the evidence is that sort of keeping benefits even more eager for single mother households might affect some households on the margin, but is unlikely to meaningfully, reverse these trends. And let me just point out again, in other countries where there are much more generous safety nets, we do not see the level of single parenthood that we do in the US. Okay, let me just show you quickly just correlations to make this point really clear. I'm just showing you here the 3 education cross 4 race ethnic groups. What has happened to these groups? Change in male earnings and difference in marriage rates. And you see a very clear pattern that the groups of men who did the best economically over this time period, marriage rates have decreased the least for those men. Okay, so this is consistent with a marriageable man story. Now let me show you the change in women's relative earnings. The groups for whom women's earnings compared to men increased by the most, that's the high school educated groups. They saw the largest decrease in marriage. So this is consistent with the story about women's relative economic progress. Now what I want to show you is the change in women's earnings. Women who did the best economically over these 4 decades, college-educated women, have had the lowest levels of reductions in marriage. So this rejects just the more basic idea of, gosh darn it, we told you that when women got economic opportunities, they weren't going to get married anymore. Okay, what I'm showing you here is that feminist success is not at odds with marriage. In fact, it's the women who have benefited the most from all of the economic opportunities that have been open to us who are still benefiting from the institution of marriage. And again, this is why any feminists or others who care about equity among women should be concerned that it's women who are least economically successful who are most likely to be finding themselves raising kids in a house by themselves. Okay, there is causal evidence of a link for all this. I won't run you through those papers, but they exist and they're really compelling. So for example, authors have shown that in communities where there was larger import competition from China after China's ascension to the WTO in the 2000s. In those communities, there was a loss of manufacturing jobs. That was sort of a loss of well-paying, family-sustaining jobs for non-college educated men. And then there was a subsequent increase in the share of kids born outside marriage growing up in single-parent homes. Similarly, in communities where there was a larger increase in the adoption of industrial robots, lost some industrial jobs that offered well-paying jobs to non-college educated men. We see an increase in the share of kids growing up in single-parent homes. Namishanov's paper uses variation in industry composition to show that in communities where women did relatively better just because of changing labor market factors, that's where you saw an increase in non-marriage. So there is really an causal evidence of this economic link. So for a long time, when I was asked, what I would say is to reverse trends, what we need to do is improve the economic position of non-college educated men. And then there was a context in which we had an increase, or an exogenously determined increase in the economic opportunities in both absolute and relative earnings of men, and that was the fracking boom in the early 2000s. So let's think outside of North Dakota where you had a whole bunch of migrants moving in, so that's a different situation. But in communities all across the country where there was this ability to engage in this fracking technology in the early 2000s, you see very clearly an increase in the earnings of high school educated men, non-college educated men, much more so than women. You see an increase in employment of men in those communities, and it's not just in the oil and gas extraction. These were localized economic booms. And so I was like, this is an awesome opportunity to look for the reverse marriageable men story. So what I expected to see was in those communities, we'd see a reduction in the non-marital birth share, a reduction in the share of kids living in single-parent homes. I looked at this with my colleague Riley Wilson, and what we found was a pretty precise 0. There was no reduction in the non-marital birth share at all. What happened was you saw that this increase in income did lead to an increase in fertility. Economists have documented this. Kids are what we call normal goods. When people get additional income, one of the things they do is they pay for the cost of having kids, okay? People generally like kids. When you get more income, you're more likely to have them. Okay, we see that. But what was really interesting was we saw that increase in births among people, whether they were married or not. And there was no increase in marriage rates. There was no reduction in the non-marital birth share. So that was a surprise, and we started thinking about what could drive it and sort of landed on this idea that social norms mattered. So we looked across communities that had different ex-ante rates of single motherhood, single-parent households, non-marital childbearing. And in fact, you did see a larger increase in non-marital births in communities where non-marital births were already more prevalent. So then we went back to the 1970s and 80s when there was a coal boom and bust. So very similar communities, similar type of economic shock. What did we see in the data happen then? We saw an increase in marriage and a reduction in the non-marital birth share. We interpret this as suggestive that in the 70s and 80s, when there was an increase in males' earnings and employment, people had more kids, but only if they were married, and they were more likely to get married. Then you have a very similar shock 20 years later, when non-marital childbearing is common. There's already been a widespread decoupling of having kids from the institution in marriage in many communities, and you don't get the same response. Okay, so I think that underscores how economics and social context interact. Okay, and so that, that leads me to where I'm ultimately going to conclude we need to go. One final point about what's not driving these trends are not being driven by an increase in births to groups that have historically had high rates of single motherhood. This increase in kids living in one-parent homes has happened despite all the trends in birth rates. Births are way down in the US, in particular among younger women. So basically, all groups under the age of 30 are having fewer children than they did in the past. Teen births are down by over 70% from the mid-1990s. So, to the extent that teen childbearing is a social challenge, both for the teen moms and their children, we've done a great job of bringing that rate down. And those are the groups that typically had high rates of single motherhood. Okay, it's also the case that moms, Hispanic moms in particular, moms with less than high school education, groups that typically had elevated rates of single motherhood, births are way down. So this is very surprising. Okay, the share of births, let's put it this way: moms are much more highly educated and older than they were in the recent past. If you told me in the 1990s or in 2000 that by 2020 only 5% of births would be to teen moms, or that 33% of moms would have a college degree, I would have predicted a decline in the share of kids being born outside marriage. I think most people studying these issues probably would have. But instead, what we've had is a really large increase in the share of births born to unmarried parents. It's now at 40%. And the reason why is because non-marital births are up for all groups. So if you just, sort of did the change in what moms look like, based on non-marital birth shares in the 1980s, we would have predicted a decline in kids being born outside of marriage. But the share of kids born outside of marriage has doubled for each group. So high school educated moms in 1990, only 25% of them had births outside of marriage. By 2019, that was 52%. Okay, so this is what's driving it. This is why, again, marriage winds up being so important, because it's the decline in marriage among parents, the increase in the share of parents never married, the increase in the share of births born outside of marriage. That is what is driving this major trend in how kids change and how kids are growing up. Okay, so the recap here: we had broad changes in social norms and attitudes. Then we went into the 90s, early 2000s. There were economic forces that drove down the employment and wages for non-college educated men. That led to a decoupling of childbearing and marriage and a lot of affected populations and areas. And my read of this situation is we are now in a new social paradigm where, frankly, it's going to be very hard to reverse things, but I don't think we can afford to not try. Okay, so what do I think we can and should do about these trends? Mostly thinking about this for the sake of kids. This is really the only controversial thing I say in the book, despite what you might have seen some people say about me. Okay, I really do think we need to foster a norm of two-parent homes for kids. And so that's the normative conversation that we can have. The disagreement is others who will say, look, the two-parent family is a thing of the past. Get on with it. And let's talk about ways to improve the resources of single-parent homes. The reason I think that is such a defeatist position that I'm not willing to accept is because the thing of, the two-parent family is not a thing of the past for the most advantaged groups in society. So from a point of view of equity, we should want more parents to have access to that supportive institution, and we should want more kids to have access to that really beneficial household arrangement. Okay, so the class divide here, I think, is something that we should not be resigned to. I also, frankly, again, we definitely should be doing more to improve the resource situation of lower income, under-resourced single-parent homes. But if we don't address this family divide and the massive gaps in the share of kids growing up with the benefit of two parents in their homes, we're just not going to be able to close those gaps in kids' childhood experiences in a meaningful way. All right, so I think that, reasserting the norm and the expectation and the benefit of two-parent homes for kids is really important. As I said, I think we need to improve the economic position of men without a college level of education, so more of them view themselves and are viewed by their partners as stable, attractive financial providers to a home. I think of that as a necessary but not sufficient condition. I do not think we should bemoan women's economic independence or suggest that women's economic liberation is the issue we need to reverse here. I don't think we should stigmatize single moms or encourage unhealthy marriages. I don't think we should run unsuccessful government marriage programs. But the good news is, after that, those programs that were tried in the early 2000s by the Bush administration weren't successful at increasing rates of marriage. Those programs really shifted into more of a healthy families emphasis. The problem is they are vastly underfunded. Only 1% of the Federal Administration and Children and Families budget goes to what they call families to support and strengthen safe families. And in fact, I looked recently at their 167-page budget document, the Administration for Children and Families of the Department of Health and Human Services. There is one paragraph on the role of families and family structure. So there are promising programs around the country being tried by committed community groups. We have not found something that I think works particularly well, but I think that reflects the fact that we really haven't invested policy, research, emphasis and funding to these kinds of programs. And my policy prescription here is that we need to scale up programs that show promise in strengthening families and invest in learning what works. And I just want to be clear, I do think we have to have a stronger safety net for families, regardless of family structure. While I will grant that there is a tension that on the margin, there are some people who will decide to be single parents when there's more government support available. But given how much we know about the benefit of bringing additional income into low-income homes for kids, I think that's a trade we have to make. And so I just want to be clear, I am not advocating for restricting redistribution or help to low-income families under a hope that would convince more of them to get married. Okay, so I will stop there.
Great talk, Melissa. I'm curious about the cross-country differences. Most of your statistics were within the U.S. over time. I didn't know about the much higher rates of single-parent households in the U.S. relative to most of the rest of the world. Do you have a sense, is that mostly the social contagion aspect that you were describing, the differences, or has there been any work to try to tease out the differences across countries?
Yeah, interestingly, so I don't know where these sort of level differences come from. If you look at Asia, there's really low rates of single parent households, and I showed you that in the U.S., the Asian Americans have lower rates of single parent households. Doing some digging, it doesn't look like the economic situation for those groups was different. So in the US, it suggests that it might be cultural. Anecdotally, that sort of fits with what you'll hear talking to people. So I'm open to the idea that it's sort of baked in cultural differences across places. Really interestingly, though, when you look at what's happened in these 40 years in other high-income countries, because I look specifically at European countries, you do see an increase in single parenthood. There's been a large increase in non-marital childbearing in these countries over that time period, still below the US, but the trend is catching up. And it's been driven by, in the international data sets, it's like they divide education groups into three. It's driven by outside the top education group. So a very similar educational gradient is emerging in these other countries, which I think also speaks to the role of economics, because a lot of these economic shocks that disadvantage non-college educated men also disadvantage non-college educated workers and men in these other countries, perhaps to a lesser degree because they had stronger labor market or policy institutions in place, but you see this similar fanning out very clearly. I presented a lot of this work at a conference over in London that pulled together demographers and scholars from different European countries a few years ago before the book came out, and they were shocked. They were people came up to me like, I can't believe you're putting this out. This is so anti-feminist. One of the women said to me, I just wrote a report for, I won't call out her country, but for my country on child poverty, and I would never look by family structure. And I thought this was really interesting because I was like, you know what? We thought in the US that US women were going to have more than 2 kids in perpetuity, and we're finally starting to converge down and looking to Europe for lessons on what do you do when fertility declines. You guys should look at the US and see what's happened as we've sort of just experienced this rise in non-marital childbearing, increase in single-parent households. I think there's been, again, my best read is some sort of an erosion of a social norm over there. It's championed by, again, in my experience talking to journalists and stuff, it seems to be championed as part of like a feminist success story. And I hope what our data makes clear is this is not a feminist success story. And so I think they need to be cautious.
First and foremost, fantastic talk.
Oh, thank you.
I am curious on the data when it came in for education levels with women. We saw the very clear difference of less than high school education to some high school education, some college, four-year college. Is there anything significant on men's education that would change any of those factors? Like say, for example, a partner that had a male four-year education and high school education for women, or was that not studied in that one?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I haven't tried to break it down in terms of it's eminently doable. I have not done it. Assortative mating is really high. And so the more refined where you get the less educated woman married to a particularly, like someone really outside her education class or vice versa, you start to worry that those couples are uniquely different in ways I can't put my finger on. But just as a descriptive exercise, it would be interesting to do, and I haven't done it. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. Okay, I have a question. How does this correlate with the decline of people that would say that they're people of faith or church attendance? And it's got to have a similar.
I know, this is really embarrassing.
I don't want to lead the witness.
This is really embarrassing. I have gotten this question in every audience I've talked to that are not economists. And I admit it's not in my book, not deliberately, but I really just didn't bring that lens to it. So I don't have a very good answer for you. It's not missing because I was trying to bury it. It's missing because, again, it was outside my lens on this. It's certainly the case, what I can tell you, is it's certainly the case that, the trends line up in terms of the decline in religiosity, the decline in two-parent families, the decline in fertility. These things line up. I have trouble drawing the causal arrows. I just don't know of good causal evidence, one preceding the other. My hunch, but really in the book, my threshold for putting something in the book was I could footnote at least a causal economic story. But my hunch on this, which is probably everyone else's hunch, is these things are all related and they're amplifying each other. And I haven't thought of a good way to sort of show that, in places where we see religiosity turns around, you see this reverse or something like that. But one of the things I do say in my final chapter on what do we have to do to change this is the role of social norms and role models. We know that trusted local leaders, and here I'm thinking of parish leaders, mosque leaders, they're trusted in their community. We have evidence that messaging from celebrities to local leaders to TV matters. And so I think of the sort of erosion of people's commitment to institutions of faith or engagement with institutions of faith as a place where that's potentially something that needs to be turned around when you have local leaders or trusted faith leaders sort of preaching this message. Anecdotally, a bunch of faith leaders will tell you, especially in communities hard hit by these trends, that they won't take this up because it alienates their congregants. And that to me is that's worrisome. You're if leaders of faith can't take this up without further alienating their congregants, how do we sort of start to bring back this social norm? So anyway, that's what I can say about that. And I know it's unsatisfying.
Related to that, there seems to be a messaging differential. And so we know that through social media or even just the news media, there's a very small amount of voices with a very broad audience. And most of the people, say, in Hollywood may have very alternative situations, but they are the total outliers in any statistical or data gathering operation. But they're the loudest voices. And so they're saying big messages, big things, and it's how did the low-income people get such a gap of knowledge from the college-educated people? And how do you close that gap? Basically, how do you foster a norm of two-parent homes if places of faith are not wanting to touch it and you're getting reverb even with all this data? How do you propose that happens from just like a economic?
So I think this is super interesting. It gets further from my area of expertise, but I will will tell you what I think. First, let me mention the work of Rob Henderson. I don't know if you've seen Rob Henderson, I only came across him after I wrote this book. He reached out to me. He has a new memoir that just dropped this month. It's called Troubled. He grew up in the foster care system, having experienced a lot of family instability. The basics of his really remarkable story are very, very troubled youth, really felt very clearly the lack of family stability in his life, got to the military, got straightened out in a sort of J.D. Vance way, winds up at Yale. And at Yale, and he's young, so this wasn't long ago, he encountered what he refers to as luxury beliefs, where he's like, every kid in my seminar grew up in a two-parent family, but they would never talk about the role of two-parent families. And his whole thing on luxury beliefs is people in the elite classes can afford to have these luxury beliefs because they're not living them. And it's folks outside their class who have absorbed the message that things like family structure doesn't matter and are reaping the consequences. So he really pushes that narrative. I point to, again, like, we do know social media has influences. I even point to in the book, President Obama gave a really powerful speech on Father's Day in 2008 about how many dads were missing from kids' homes, and he never brought it up again. And what I'm told is his political advisors were like, don't go there. And so I think it takes some courageous leaders, respected leaders, to actually make this message in a positive way. The thing I am really sensitive to is I recognize that it's hard to sort of promote one type of family structure without it feeling like you're stigmatizing another. I am optimistic to think we could get that right. So for instance, in New York City, maybe a decade ago, there was a campaign against teen childbearing on the subways where they had pictures of crying kids basically telling their teen moms that they wrecked their lives. It was so cruel. I mean, I would see those pictures and would literally be viscerally irate. It was so cruel, as if teen moms are teen moms because of an overabundance of confidence, right? So this was terrible. But now in all of the bus stops in DC, you have these take time to be a dad ads that have these really sweet affirming pictures of dads like having tea parties with their daughters. Does it work? I don't know. But I think there's a difference there in having a positive affirming message versus a stigmatizing message. I think that's probably what we need to do.
One thing would be whether there's any economic benefit to men who are either high school educated or not quite high school educated to staying married. Does that make sense? So in other words, one benefit you could say to men is to say, well, actually, if you stay married, you're more likely to, because it might seem to them that, but if I stay married, now it's gonna drain me somehow. But if there were evidence, the other thing is just a story real quickly was that I have some friends who are whatever, and the marriage counselor said, yeah, there's no problem if you get divorced on children. And I just thought, I don't know how this person says this when the data is so very clear. It seems to me a kind of malpractice of counseling in a way. Anyway, but back to the issue of I don't know whether, again, to all men in all circumstances, to say you actually would do financially better if you stayed married, with all the warnings that you give about, but don't stay in marriage, is abusive, et cetera, et cetera.
So descriptively, it is true that men who are married have higher earnings, they have better health, they live longer. Descriptively, that's all very true. Brad Wilcox, who is at UVA, has a book that came out on Valentine's Day this year. It's called Get Married. And basically, the narrative he's pushing is this, I'm in some sense like, look, it's better for the kids. And I'm totally agnostic about whether it's better for the parents. And so, one reaction you could say is, well, if parents aren't happy in their marriage, should they stay together anyway? And I say parents should, do what you want, but be clear. This matters for your kids. And so, yes, that counselor, that's just a flat out lie, right? And so in that situation, the truth would be, you might be happier not living with this person. But again, assuming that it's just because, and it's hard to get statistics on this, but my understanding is, like 40% of divorces are initiated because of infidelity now. Like, it's not abuse driving the majority of them, right? So infidelity might make the parents really unhappy, but is it better for the kids? My read of the data would say probably, despite what counselors and others assert. So I'm like admitting this trade-off. What Brad Wilcox says is there isn't a trade-off. Married people are happier. Adults, it's in their own interest to get married. I don't know if causally that's true. It's just really hard to disentangle. Where causally, I'm pretty convinced that having two parents in the home is better for kids. But it's certainly, the descriptive evidence certainly supports that. To the couples therapist story, I talk a little bit about the evidence on divorce for kids. Again, I don't go too far down there because I don't want to lose sight of the main fact that it's not divorce that's driving this for kids. But there's a new paper, it's circulating, I don't think it's been publicly released yet, that uses all of the tax data to show how divorce affects kids. It basically finds what most studies find, which is divorce is bad for kids. And what's really compelling in this paper is that the earlier in a child's lifetime the parent's divorce happens, so the more years they spend outside a married parent home, it's almost like linear, the worse are their kids' outcomes. So that study is a counterpoint to this idea that, well, it's really bad for kids if they grow up with parents who are like contemplating divorce, and is more support, I think, for the idea of, again, as long as it's not an extreme situation, the longer parents stay together for the sake of the kids does look like it benefits kids' outcomes.
Thank you for an amazing book and research. And I think that there is a role in shaping culture, because I wish that women in my generation and younger were told that, instead of saying, fight for higher wages, because you're just showing that that's absolutely not going to work. I have a question, like how you defined married, because you defined marriage at the beginning as a long term, but I'm not someone that deals with, like, I can't draw statistics myself, so it's not my expertise. So I don't understand, like, the married couple is a couple that is married for as long as the child lives.
So this is actually, it's a hard question. In the book, I just made the decision to basically tabulate my statistics as point in time, like what is the kids' living arrangement now. In the study where I showed the differences using the PSID, we know whether the kids' parents are married at age 14, and we just take that. Other studies have tried to do like share of childhood that the parents are married when you look at more longitudinal data. So the statistics that I show you on like whether the parents are married, like almost overstate how many kids have married parents, because a lot of those kids will at some point have parents who are unmarried. So if I presented the descriptive statistics that way, the share of kids living outside a two-parent home would be larger if I looked at any point in their childhood. But I think the way to think about it, again, because all the studies do it differently, basically the longer, this relates to the answer I just gave about divorce, the best situation for kids is to experience their whole childhood in a married parent situation with their biological parents. And then, you can also, then some studies can look at whether the parent is remarried. And so then it's marriage, but it's not the kid's biological. And those studies that look at relationships, there's sort of a clear taxonomy that, your parents being married the whole time is sort of the best situation. You're living with a single mother who was never married in terms of kids' outcomes is the worst situation, and the others fall in between. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks very much. My pleasure. Thanks.